What microphone? Sorry, six?
Robert Miller, the University of Kansas. When we were talking about holding objects and sort of, having that, I think that, what I find very limiting about material culture, just viewing an image, is we're only getting really one sense.
Yeah.
And so the multi-sensory experience that you would get even beyond the tactile, when we were looking at the watch, is it, I don't know if we would have it working, but, is it ticking? Is it, what's it feel like? What's the smell? I think that provides a much richer experience that, again, we're sort of limited oftentimes by our sources.
Right. Yeah, and that something's in the box I'm just circulating is a box from Algeria that's made out of cedar. And so that has to get its full, you need all of your senses except for taste. Except even if you smell it really hard, you actually taste it. So you get and you hear it also as it closes. So that I think part of what's so crucial about using material culture is the fact that it does engage. Sometimes one, but generally many senses and the senses beyond sight, which matters because that's how we are in the world. And that's how people use all of those senses all of the time to generate meaning and to communicate. And so if you only use materials that engage your eyes, then you're cutting off an enormous amount of knowledge about the past that you could get through this stuff. But then there is the question, okay, you have to use your imagination often, and again, working analogically. So if you know a box was made of cedar, you know it smelled, even if you don't have the box. If you have a comb that has diamonds embedded in it, you know it sparkled. Even if you've never seen it, it's going to create a very particular dynamic in the hair being worn. So there's a kind of education in materiality that one can give oneself, that then when you encounter these particular objects or encounter descriptions of the objects, you do the same way that we've all been trained to do with texts, right? I mean, you're reading an 18th century text and you hit a weird word. You know it's a weird word because you've read thousands of other texts, and so its weirdness stands out and you think, oh, I better explain this. Or, and part of why we insist on getting really serious linguistic training so that we can actually know what's strange and what's not strange. Or handwriting even, when you're doing, that you read a huge, that's a materiality of language actually. You read a huge amount from what the handwriting does, and you know what the handwriting means because you've read all of these things. So it's the same process, but obviously the more distant from our own world, material world, the harder it is to give yourself the experience that you need to make that, to accurately do that analogical reading. And I think starting from the assumption of massive ignorance is incredibly important. So that, let me also circulate something else that some people know what this is, but any idea what that could be? Guesses?
Wind chimes.
Oh, well.
So you know if somebody comes in.
Yeah. It's actually a necklace. That it's a necklace I bought in Paris last summer, and it's hung on string. The pieces are steel. The little hooks on it are gold, I think. The little rings, and it's soldered with silver. So one needs, so you have this thing appears to you, and you kind of think, okay, how do I begin to figure out what this is? And then once you've done, and then if you know, so you have to figure out what class of object it is. If you're in the wind chime class, you're never going to locate it. But that's a perfectly reasonable hypothesis. And so once you move it into the jewelry class, then knowing it's a 21st century object, you're making progress, because then you think, okay, this is odd by jewelry notions, so I can begin to look around to see, and so what do we learn about jewelry and fashion in 21st century Paris that this is considered something that's desirable to sell as a piece of jewelry? What's the critique of precious metal? What's the critique of a certain definition of femininity? You know, and then you would again want to spin out from this, you know, that's pretty clearly, you know, not mass produced. You could read that from it easily. But then are there lots of things kind of like this? You know, again, to do the whole chain, you could come up with a pretty good analysis of of a moment in the fashion and value system. And that's being generated. You might end up thinking about this in relationship to the discussion about, about the violence associated with mining precious metal, you know, and spin out a whole trajectory. But it's important again to handle that if you can, because it's, you know, it's sharp, it clangs, and posing the question of why string, you know, which is the kind of, I discovered it's fairly uncomfortable to wear. It kind of pokes you. And even things, again, just so this is fairly, the things that you don't think of, I mean, you know that they touch the body, but you don't think of them in the same way of combs or jewelry. But, you know, but books that, and taking their materiality and the question of contact. I mean, the two I just sent out, you know, one is huge and one is tiny. So,
this one was my cooking books when I was a child.
Yeah. And did you use it?
Yeah, all the time. It was in the same shape,
yeah.
aspects. Like
right.
Third grade.
Right. Yeah. And so that was mine. It has, and so thinking about, again, I was one curse of digitized books, taking books seriously as things. And if you go, for example, to the cookbook collection at the Schlesinger Library in Cambridge, when I was a grad student, I was involved in cataloging stuff. And one of my tasks that when we got new collections before they went to be fumigated was to note which pages had how many blotches. So that, you know, for obvious reasons. I mean, then you can figure out which recipes were made and how often. And so you can tell from that one which ones I really liked and which ones I stayed away from like the plague. And so that you could do a whole, again, whereas if you just think about it as a book, as a, you know, that is a reproducible object, you'll never, you know, you've chopped off half of what you can do. And this, so you know, yeah.
You can go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask, do you know what this one is?
I do,
You figure out? It's the Livre du Compagnonnage of Pertiguier. So it's the book that accompanied the journeymen on their carpenters, cabinet makers on their tour of France. And so there too, I mean, there's a lot you could say about it simply from reading its table of contents. It has a particular array of stuff in it, and so on. But but it matters a lot that it's it's the size that you can shove in your back pocket. The nature of the binding, it's got diagrams for how to draw and how to build a staircase. It's got all kinds of stuff contained within that physical format, which is an essential part of the narrative. I mean, that's a classic argument from book people, but book people and material culture people tend to be different people, although they shouldn't be. I mean, this is part of my argument. But you were going to say something else.
Yes, I'm Catherine Dunlop from Montana State University. Oh, is it on? Number 7.
And I'm a historian of cartography, so I'm really interested by this discussion. And one of the things that we talk about in some of our conferences is how to sort of reattach maps to the objects that they were originally in. So a book like this is really interesting because there's a plan in here that if it had been cut out, then it would be sort of disembodied. But by reattaching it to the book in which it was originally placed, you get a whole different understanding of use.
Yeah.
And also with maps and size, it's really important to, on a screen, you have no idea how large a map actually is until you see it, in its real sort of form. So I love the idea of sort of thinking about use from kind of bringing the objects back into, especially if they've been detached into their original sort of form.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, another curse of, it doesn't matter so much with this image, but with others, of these kind of, things. Now, why did that happen? Let me just see if I can, there we go. There's a problem of luminosity, particularly for texts. That makes it, they kind of glow on the screen, which they don't in person. And so to get at that, so there's the scale problem. There's also the texture problem, and even sometimes there's an advantage. They can be much more visible, actually. Yes, Les.
Number 6, Celeste Daymore, Hamilton College. I was curious, Leora, because I know you're using these examples as because of the objects they're describing, but have you had experience using archives as objects? To say, using this as a way of kind of thinking about where this object came from, or particularly the paper.
Yeah, in this case, absolutely. One of the kinds of information that's carried by the restitution documentation was the state of paper in Paris in 1944. This particular one, again, this one is about, it's shredded, it's torn out of it's a paper bag, actually. And so as you read the archive, the array of paper that these documents are written on is incredibly informative. And there's, of course, a correlation. This one is written, the way I excerpted it, you can't really tell, but the spelling, this was written by a Russian immigrant whose spelling in French was really kind of exotic and approximate. But sauté, for example. Without an H, that's an obvious, but that wealthier people who had more stuff had more access to pens rather than crayons to write these lists in. They weren't using paper bags. So the class structures that managed to reproduce, to remain relatively stable over a period of extreme hardship, but also the degree of it. But even the wealthy are typing things on the backs of things or writing things on the backs of things. So yeah, there's one learns a tremendous amount of auxiliary kinds of things from the physicality of the archive itself, as well as the question of just who gets to have an archive at all, which is a whole other kind of who gets to, exists in this form. One other just thing about, while we're on kind of more paper things, that this, when I was, I used to be a furniture maker, and before I got back into this trade, and my dissertation, which became my first book, was about the furniture industry in Paris. And one of the ways that I got archives was I wrote letters to hundreds of furniture companies and asked if they had archives, and one of them was in the process of throwing out their archive, and so I have an archive. And one of the things, this was a Schmidt Company, and this was the second project for a Salon Louis XVI that was done, one knows, after 1900, since they had a Grand Prix 1900. And you can get a sense of, so this was something they showed to clients. And it's a watercolor. It's a drawing and a watercolor. And this one doesn't, some of them have potted plants on them. There's a kind of dynamic, and again, this column here, they were not selling the column, actually. But when one's trying to figure out what Louis XVI meant in 20th century French commercial life and aesthetic life, it's very, very different to look at this and to see and to know about the interaction that would have been had. So a client could look at this and say, they're buying an atmosphere, right? They're buying an atmosphere, they're buying an aesthetic, they're buying a thing that can be called Louis XVI, but really isn't. I mean, if one's looked at actual Louis XVI furniture, it doesn't look like this. It's got the right signs of it. It's got the skinny, the tapering legs, the cantillations. It's got enough so it passes. But and it was working from these kinds of things, and I traded labor in there, trying to put some order into the archives they were saving, for the right to look at this stuff. They didn't care if I took it or not because they didn't want any. They were just throwing it out. But to be able to say that it wasn't incompetence that was causing late 19th and 20th century French cabinet makers to make things in old regime styles, but rather it was a set of interactions between the consumers and the producers that caused that to come into existence. So this is a material object as well as the illustrations that it carries was really, and this is a kind of argument that I'm always reluctant to make because it makes people feel like will never do this kind of work, is that part of what mattered was that I had built furniture, because they would test me before they'd let me, and they'd lie to me. And then I would say, well, no, that's not a Louis, no, that's not a piece of oak, that's a piece of walnut. No, that's not, a kind of whole set of tests. And then you pass the test, and then they decide you're worth talking to. So the issue of knowledge acquisition can be sort of daunting. This one, unless you did it by accident, this is a working drawing that goes along with that, where you have all kinds of commentaries and sketches about modifying the objects being produced. And so each of these had dossiers where you can watch the process by which people are determining what these will look like. But even these, one of the things is that they bother to put the brass in brass, in yellow, so that there's an aesthetic to all of these objects. So if you're interested in people's engagement with things, like anything having to do with labor or consumption or distribution, if you don't pay really, really serious attention to the things themselves, then you miss much of the story, I think. Yeah.
Number 6, my name is Leora Auslander
from Schmidt College, and I just want to return briefly to your comment about the visual culture people being separate from the material culture people, and which is absolutely true. And I experience sometimes by looking at certain of the, examples and saying, that's visual culture, that's not material culture. And my instinct, and which I want to resist, though, but I also want to get your reaction to, is I tend to believe that in certain instances, for certain types of objects or certain uses of the objects, certain senses are more important than others. So when something needs to be considered in its full materiality, multi-sensory dimension, is some of the times, in certain cases, for certain objects. And I was wondering what your response to that was, because it limits both the kind of expansiveness of material culture studies, but I'm willing also to accept that visual culture is making claims that it, above and beyond what it can contribute to our knowledge.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, actually. In the sense that I think the boundary between visual culture and material culture and their study is a useful boundary. So something like, no, that's a bad example. That's an okay example. That's a print. And that, to my mind, is a piece of visual culture, because what it is, it's also a piece of material culture, of course. It has a physicality to it, and again, but anybody who does visual culture will also say slides are lousy. So that's not really a difference. That you need to see, you need to see the thing itself if you're going to get it. But that is something that you approach with your eyes. You don't touch it in normal life. It sits on a wall. Your contact with it is visual. It may evoke other senses, but it's not like the necklace that was going around, or the book. You don't. So to I make a kind of very, primitive separation, which is the things you basically look at seem to me visual culture, and to be accessed through the tools of visual culture, and the things that you touch or that surround you. So space is a part of material culture, I think. So I do a lot of work on buildings and design, which seems to me really, that falls within the purview, whereas things that sit on walls, yeah.
So just to add to that, my mother, for instance, has, the china cabinet full of objects she never touches.
Yeah.
So the teapot is there, but it's only looked at.
Yeah, no, but that's different because she never touches it because she could break it, in part. I mean, that is things that you can't, that are designed to be touched, that you do not touch. The absence of that touching is part of their materiality, I think, is part of the practice. Because that's a conscious move to stick a teacup behind in a vitrine and leave it there. You've transformed it into something else. I don't think you've transformed it into visual culture. You've transformed it into a museum object. It would be and that I think is a really important part of its story, that at that point it's no longer being touched. But that's different from something that was never intended to be touched.
Yeah, I would think about this in terms of my work on the reception of African sculpture in France. And there, actually, it's precisely the fact that the object has previously been touched and shows the traces of that handling and is now not touched.
Yeah.
That's aestheticized.
Right.
Right, so it's like a kind of, this thing becomes very blurry where the separation occurs.
Yeah. I think a Potterized stuff about the social life of things and the biography of things is really helpful there, because I think that thinking about that objects can have things trajectories in which they live in the world very differently. So an African sculpture wasn't a sculpture actually when it was in Africa. It was something else, and then it becomes a sculpture when it moves to France and is stuck on a pedestal, or a teacup that's being used that then, to jump to something. I mean, it's not quite the same because it's touchable, but my last image, that's a samovar that my grandparents used, and it made tea. It no longer makes tea, it just sits there. But the fact that it did make tea, it's a little different because it's not in the case, but that's it. It matters that it once made tea. It matters that it doesn't anymore. And so, I think that there's also, I think, the question of the fields in which objects are moving. So, part of where I think it's important to keep visual culture, the integrity of visual culture, at least some elements of it, just like the integrity of subfields within material cultures, those are the reference. So if you want to read paintings well, if you want to read 18th, 19th century French paintings, you'd better have your head full of the field of visual culture that is being referred to and is referenced in those paintings, as well as the social world. Or if you want to read furniture, you need to kind of have the sense of furnitureness. So I agree that it shouldn't be collapsed. We might disagree about which things fall into which categories, but it's other thoughts, kind of, yeah.
I'd like to ask more of a pedagogical question.
Yeah.
I'm April Shelford, and I teach at American University in Washington, D.C. And one of the things that I've learned in teaching about early modern Europe is that I can send students down to the National Gallery of Art to look at paintings for a variety of reasons, or sculpture, and that they really like it, and that these are really good assignments and very strong. But one of the things that I've thought about as I've kind of experimented with using the gallery as a resource for teaching about early modern Europe is, usually we're talking about familial relationships, we're talking about status, that's what we're looking at, what we're looking for, but these objects, these paintings are full of things and stuff, and that stuff changes, and how much is there, and all those kinds of questions about material culture. Now, they can't touch these things. I mean, they have to just be looking at them. And so one of my questions about this is I would like to be able to incorporate ideas about how to think about material culture as they're looking at these paintings and sculpture as well.
Right.
But I'm not really sure how to do that because they are going to be very much separated from the things. And I don't want it to be just kind of like a demonstration of what historians think. I mean, I would like it to be more of a process of discovering what objects might mean or why they're there.
Right. Well, if you, I'm sorry, this is taking me, I mean, this is, that's a photograph, not a painting, but it's easy for me to pull up, so let me just show you. So if you wanted, your students want to see this in a gallery, then the question of what you would want to, so they're not going to be able to touch any of this stuff. And so, but then what I would do in a classroom is to take it apart. That is, that you isolate the different, so this is a mother of pearl, you study the objects in it. This is a mother of pearl chest that has, and this little silver thing and this giant urn, and to do the labor of disarticulating what they're going to find in the image, and then doing a combination of finding analogous things in other images, so that at least they can get often a clearer sense of it, and then sometimes again. Like the playing cards, if there's something that you can actually physically that is touchable, that has kind of that has a similar mass, a similar physicality, a similar surface. Again, it's not the same, but they can get a sense of how heavy it is, if it's what it would have felt to use. I mean. Forks often, silverware is often much larger in the past, and it's interesting to think about silverware being larger. So, and you can get hold of big silverware, or thinking about this thing is, is a spoon used to feed babies, but it's just a teaspoon bent. It's a regular teaspoon, and it's not shrunk. So, so there's a whole thing that's going on here about how you adapt to babies, which is a fairly limited. I mean, it's convenient for the parents because you've got this nice little thing to hang on to, and you can rest your finger so you can give the baby the food without it holding it flat. But the baby still has to negotiate this enormous, from a baby's point of view, spoon. So that it's and so likewise, for 17th century, flatware where you can find reproductions of it, stuff that's out there, to give a sense of the weight of that. But and also I think to decompose it, individualize it so they can think about the array, and then also to set up images so that you get a sense of difference of how much stuff there is, or what kind of stuff. So they become attentive to the stuff as opposed to the things you're supposed to look for in paintings from an art historical standpoint, which is generally not the stuff. It's how the light works, how the technique, all kinds of other things that are equally important. So, it's not that I think at all that the traditional ways of looking at these things are invalid. It's just that there's an array of knowledge one has missed by not being attentive to this other stuff. But also convention, so it's really important that they get a sense, maybe all dining rooms in the 17th century were painted with a table, or virtually all coming out of the Flemish tradition were painted with a certain kind of table, illuminated in a certain kind of way with 6 chairs. That's really important to know if you're thinking that there's, that this is, that you can know something about what any particular interior looked like because it had a table and 6 chairs. Perhaps not. And so they need to both you can give them access both to the specificity of the objects and the specificity of the genre, and then they'll find it, I think, much more accessible, and actually able to analyze it and not think about how historians are thinking about it. There was another, no? Yeah. You have a mic?
Let's track the numbers if you remember which number it is.
Pedagogical question as well. I'm going to be teaching. Oh, sorry. I'm Grace. I'm a dissertator at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I'm teaching a course next year for sort of mid-career undergraduates on commodity culture in Europe. And I was wondering if there's like an interesting like activity you've used sort of at the beginning of a class to get students thinking about objects. I heard someone mention like 20 questions to ask an object. Of where you got that from, or okay, cool.
Yeah.
Leora could probably speak to this too. There's Material Culture Association, is it? Or yeah, I think it was about last year. They put together a session, actually kind of like this one, and the goal was to give academics objects, and there were 20 questions were composed that you're supposed to ask an object, and they created a video in which they introduce the 20 questions and they show people using the questions to interrogate objects and then talking with one another. So that video itself is a pretty great teaching tool, and then the questions are really useful. Yeah. And if you just Google search 20 questions to ask an object, you'll find the video and the questions.
Yeah, I agree. It's a fabulous. And I almost always start classes like that with something. I bring in a bunch of stuff and get people to talk about it. I sometimes do a two-stage, which is to let them do that without the 20 questions, just as a kind of free-for-all, and then move to the. It's a wonderful resource, and there's no point in reinventing the wheel, and it really does. And then you do get from the kind of interesting free-for-all into much more specific interrogations of it, and I think it works really, really well. Other things at this point. So I wanted to back up to, and we've talked a little about this. No. This was just actually, again, an example for that was the painting I was looking when you were asking about, so this is where one can use this. And one of the exercises I do with my students sometimes is, so here's a painterly representation and Ache is not that's not just a documentary photograph. There's a whole, he's a photographer who had a mission, but nonetheless, this is a photograph that appears to be simply a random documentary photograph of an interior. This appears to be a painting that's where the interior isn't what's at stake, but yet there's a lot of information. So to think about what do you learn and what do you not learn from looking at about an interior as opposed to about painting, from looking at this, and then what happens with a photograph which is that didn't have an aesthetic mission, but is much more documentary for this dining room certainly. And so one of the things I've done with this series for students is this question of the omnipresence of the Henri II buffet, these things that are just so 53, and you could find one 2015 with no difficulty, and many, so why? What is it that makes this an attractive piece of furniture? Particularly when you get a little bit of one gets a sense of scale in these images. They're huge in what are often very tiny spaces. And so they're huge, they're heavy, they're not terribly practical by any conventional sense of the term. So to try to push students and to push oneself to think about why is there this commitment to this particular aesthetic form? What does it, and I would argue that you can parse out different information about what dining rooms mean in a French context, in a French urban context, from looking at these things, and particularly if you can, even more if you can access to the insides of them, than from reading, novelistic descriptions or etiquette books or all of the other things. And I think that the weight of the need for a certain kind of anchoring in a particular French past, a certain masculine French past, because the association between this period and masculinity, and when France, before the period of Louis XVI, when everything had become feminized, one can, I'm not going to go into the full elaboration here, but one can spin out an argument for oneself and from students from this, and again the variants that were generated by this. I had the armoire pictures because that's another, the comb is an interesting example of a trousseau, but armoires were the things that 19th century women had to bring with them when they married. And so the range of style and the nature of the melding of families that you see from these, from the armoires and their contents. Okay. This was a series that I wanted to bring. So as I said, in terms of our distinction, I don't have here examples of physical objects to give you. And this is a series that was done by a French painter and lithographer, Lévy, that show scenes of Jewish life in Paris, in this, or in France more generally, in Alphonse Lévy in this period. And any sense of what you would, they were used to determine, and the title of the book, Scène familiale juive, illustrated by Alphonse Lévy, was used by both philo-Semites and anti-Semites to kind of define what it meant to be French and what it meant to, what it meant to be Jewish and to have a Jewish domestic life in this period. So any sense of what people at the time would have been reading from these? Because this is an instance where we don't have much other kinds of
It's almost like an ethnography. Also, a kind of respectability, maybe.
Mm-hmm. This one's a little different, and yeah.
I'm also noticing there's no beautification.
Yeah. Whoops. Well, let me. What's the? And do? Okay. Yeah. So intergenerational, not beautified. Anything else out of them that you get about this ethnographic?
Who are these people? What do they look like? What do they wear? How do they interact? What's around them? What are they doing? Right? You're getting a ton of visual information about Jewish day-to-day.
Yeah.
Right? Like not just with objects, but also with
Yeah. Okay. And why do you think there's always the Hebrew for whatever the activity being described is? Do you have any hypothesis as to why, or what does it do to the image to have it? And this.
Well, it exoticizes the image.
Okay.
It makes
So.
it clear that it's other.
Yeah. Right. So it pushes it off. Yeah. Yeah.
I guess I go in the opposite way.
Huh.
It's pedagogical. That it's to keep people young, apparently, especially younger children, learning what people looks like and reading.
Okay, so you would have the audience being Jews, and you would have the audience being not Jews. Yeah.
I see the both at once because people who read Hebrew say, pedagogy. People who maybe like myself, I'm Jewish, but I never learned Hebrew. So I look at that and I say, the the script is my people, but at the same time. And so it gives me a warm, fuzzy feeling, but it's also totally meaningless. But then anti-Semites would say, oh, you know, exotic foreigner, they don't use the Roman script, they don't use French, they're aliens.
I think it's deliberate. I was thinking about Protestant Reformation propaganda, where it has text in Latin, it has text in the vernacular, it's got an image, so it's for, right, learned, vernacular, and the illiterate too. So it's all text and image work together to convey. But it's worked on different levels and maybe they can do.
I mean, here the we're losing these comments, so we can start using mics. What number are you at?
Here the Jerome number again.
What number?
Oh, this number. It's
sorry.
Oh, it's 6.
It's number 6. But this image is so much pedagogical because, I mean, you're looking at the Passover Seder plate, right? So it's teaching you all of the objects, but you also have this kind of, I guess, for me, this loving grandmother sort of gifting this. It's like some kind of gift as well, and sort of gives you a sense, I think, too, of the kind of preparations involved in a Passover Seder. I mean, all of these images are Jewish life, but they're Jewish life at very particularly important points. This isn't just a meal, this is a Seder, which is obviously one of the most important meals of the year for Jews. And so I think there's something about the sort of, it's very specific and specifically Jewish, but also not everyday Jewish. It's special Jewish, I guess, is what I would say in that way. And it would if I had this, I would know as a family what to put on the plate, how to make the plate, and how to think about my relationship to the Seder plate in this kind of way. So it's very informative, I think, when you look at these images as well. Sorry.
And I think it's also the lighting of them is striking, that it's so flat, that it's very strange lighting if you try to figure out where the light could be coming from, because it's dead on, basically. It's the only thing that makes sense. One of the things, part of why I wanted to show these to you is also because they were the subject of intense controversy within the Jewish community in France, who viewed them as altogether too close to that, which is, that they felt that he was on the border, that Alphonse Lévy was on the border of caricature. And that, what you've all been picking up on, that it could be for Jews, could be not for Jews, and the question of whether one reads this, for example, is warm and fuzzy, or it's sort of boorish, that they're kind of heavy, and there's a kind of he's jovial but almost overwhelming, perhaps, and the child is kind of has a slightly blank. These got read in this very various forms and produced enormous anxiety. So. And one of his responses was to produce images like this, which he thought would be more acceptable. That become also more. They're funnier. So the idea of shifting it that way, but also where the domestic interior becomes normalized. So instead, because here it's actually very uninformative about what the context. I mean, here you have a lamp, you have a window. I mean, it's really, and the blurriness is not the slide. It's in the image. And so then there's a notion of that through conveying the materiality of Jewish life as opposed to simply the religious ritual, that he would make Jews more human. So the whole the pedagogy of things in a different way, translated through visual culture, that's enacted in this particular set of images, is another way to particular context of thinking about the use of things, and where the goods. And on the one hand, it is the Jewishness of the household is still conveyed clearly, and there and one could argue the stereotypes are present, but with a kind of, again, the clock, the chair, the sideboard, the flowers, all of that are things that would make it, that would assimilate it to, a kind of normal context, so to speak. So I use these things, for example, in the context of a Jewish civilizations course to try to convey something else about Jewish life in France in this period than I can otherwise. Let's see. I'm just trying. We have just another couple of minutes. I have a variety of directions we could go. We have some other objects that we could talk about. Are there any other questions that are around, or I can just talk about some other things that I have floating around? Any? Yeah.
This may be a bit of a narrow question, but I wondered if you could talk about how you analyze misappropriation or misidentification in material culture. And and there are varying forms that I've encountered. Replicas, people just simply identifying something as well, this is Cambodian. Well, no, it's not. That sort of thing. How do you go about analyzing that, and how do you go about analyzing when people use objects in a specific way, but this was not really the way that they were intended to use? So it's kind of a multi-part question.
No, that's interesting. And by people, you mean the people who are the subjects of the work, or other academics, in terms of the mislabeling and misappropriation?
I was using more of the subjects of the work.
Of the history, yeah, or of the analysis. Yeah, I mean, this may be too obvious an answer, but that of trying to figure out why. I mean, what it is that causes them. So if they're saying that an object is Cambodian when it was Chinese or not, so whatever the right, what is it about the object and what is it about the categories that exist in their minds that cause the historical actors to say that, if you can do it the other way around, to say, well, the fact that they thought this was Cambodian is a way I can now think about what they thought Cambodianness was and their construction of it, and so to analyze it from there. The issue of forms of appropriation of things, of the uses, one of the things that's really tricky is to figure out if they knew how it should have been used, in quotes. That is, because it's very different to take something and misuse it on purpose than it is to, a safety pin through your nose is a different thing than if you put a stud through your nose. It's so to try to sort out and there again, it's somehow finding the field of behavior. Just figuring out what the boundary terms are, and then creating series. So if you find somebody using chamber pots for planters, which is actually something that people do, and whether that's reuse or misappropriation, do they know their chamber pots? Do they not know their chamber pots? Do they care that they're chamber pots? But that you can, once you realize that there's a series of that use, then you can also go to figure out where they're acquiring them, what the field of discourse is around them, and know whether it's an intentional disruption of a system or whether it's simply, it's a good size, it's kind of convenient, and why not? And the strategies for that vary tremendously on a case-by-case basis. I mean, not so much in terms of reappropriate, but the furniture stuff. It became clear to me in that research that the artisans knew perfectly well that what they were selling was mislabeled, but the consumers did not. So the artisans were intentionally misleading the consumers, and that was interesting. I mean, and for explicit reasons. And I could tell that by both looking at the stuff, looking at the process by which the stuff was made, and looking at what was sold and how the consumers were talking about it. So to get that nexus of communication was useful. Other? Okay, then I will subject you to 2 more objects. Any ideas? Nope.
Butter pot?
Nope. They're pretty hard.
Are they toothbrush?
Nope.
What does that say?
It says road.
Powder.
Snuffle.
Ooh, snuff holder. Nope. Flying saucer?
Ring.
That would work. Well, they're actually egg cups. And they're both contemporary French egg cups. And this is, so you learn a bunch of stuff from these things. I mean, one is, this is actually quite small. So in terms of scale of eggs in circulation. And also that this is in a Breton kind of pottery riff. They're tourist objects. So that it's a collectible that are in circulation with names, a range of names. And it's interesting because very few French people eat eggs for breakfast. So these things have entered circulation, particularly this one's interested in that dimension, as a souvenir that you bring back for someone from when you're traveling. Wherever you go, you'll find them actually, even far from, if you go to look at tourist stands, far from Brittany, and in places where people absolutely do not eat soft-boiled. I mean, you only eat these for soft-boiled eggs. And so that it's become, and I think they probably do get used for all the purposes, people have identified, or, pins or rings or something, because it's not useful, in fact, for the purpose in that context. So, and yet it's marketed as such. And I frankly don't have an explanation for that yet. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, right, which also, surely nobody's, yeah, right. Right. So the
Tourists are British.
That's right.
yeah, so right, true. If they're British tourists, that would work, and they do eat eggs. Or no, that
Remember their
right, their trip. Yeah, though the names tend to be French names on them.
identified as French.
Well, I guess yeah. So if Edouard, so if your kid's name is Edward, you buy one that says Edouard, so that it will it's charming. And this one was made by an avant-garde potter. It's kind of the pottery equivalent of that necklace I was circulating. Nobody could figure out what these are. They actually work, I discovered. But I know this potter, and in conversation she was very frustrated because nobody was buying them. and I said, and she's not in the tourist district, and she was fascinated by she knows, she never eats eggs, but she was fascinated by the technical question of how do you make, of doing something interesting with the egg cup concept that didn't, just like the necklace maker was interested in doing so. And so she started experimenting and came up with this form, and then somebody decided that it would make, actually not a friend of mine decided that if you put one of those peaky things in it for flowers, that it made a very good like bud vase. So it's now been recycled in her shop as a bud vase through the process of reappropriation. So that's a reuse that then got naturalized in the but her fascination with it was was also to take a Japanese form, because there's also a Japanese culture of egg cups, even though they too don't eat soft-boiled eggs. So the circulation of certain forms, because they're intriguing from a producer standpoint, that then take on a life of their own, separate from their, any kind of pragmatic purpose, is a whole other domain. Because you could get, again, if you're a historian coming later, finding these artifacts from 21st century France who decides, it's a big egg-eating culture, because there are all of these egg cups floating around, then gets completely confused. So it's kind of a caution. I mean, it's something that interests me because the creativity of the artisanal process interests me, but it's also a cautionary tale of thinking that of the incredible importance of contextualization. Yeah.
Stapleton. I actually have an anecdote for you about eating soft-boiled eggs in France that might help you think more about these objects. So I've spent a lot of my time in France living in Lyon, and it may be that in Paris itself this would be less common, but apparently the French think that you can only eat œufs à la coque, soft-boiled eggs, when they are extremely fresh eggs, and there's actually a whole ritual around going to the country and coming back with eggs that you know were laid within the past day or two. And a friend of ours who has horses and goes out to the countryside once in a while outside of Lyon, I remember one day she came over all excited with a little package of 6 eggs for us. Ah, je vous ai emmené des œufs. You can make some soft-boiled eggs for yourselves tomorrow, as though it's this very special thing that you do. So it may be that would contribute to the specialness of the object as well. That's what I was thinking about.
Right, which may not be crazy since they eat them very soft, so maybe they were carrying disease.
Mm-hmm.
That's number 6. Julie Landweber again from Montclair State. You also just got me thinking about this idea of an object that is in frequent circulation in a culture that doesn't seem to make use of it, or maybe they do, as Denise just said. So in my work on coffee, I've gotten into the material culture of coffee in the 18th century, and I've been incredibly frustrated looking at catalogs of porcelain collections, French porcelain collections. So like the Queen of England apparently has one of the world's largest collections of Sèvres. And it's, I don't know, 20 volumes, it's massive. And flipping through the pages of 18th century French porcelain, I see teapot, 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 teacup, teacup, teacup. And the French didn't really drink tea, they drank coffee. There are no coffee pots, there are no coffee cups, or at least they're not identified as such, which also gets to your question about misidentification. So there's these questions of absence and oddity, and maybe it's modern misinterpretation, because often these objects were not identified as a particular, they weren't their use wasn't advertised specifically by the manufacturers at the time. So it was retroactively applied sometimes.
Right.
And they're also used in
the coding system. So in England, it would be more likely for it to be a teapot. So they decide it's a teapot.
Yeah.
Even when it was, I mean, usually it's a rather different shape.
Teapots and coffee pots are more distinguished, but the cups are less distinguishable. But it's always teacup.
Right.
Yeah.
And no, I think that there is it's a frequent problem. Also in scholarly stuff. That was part of why I asked the question, and so then figuring on undoing that is a challenge.
Can I ask another quick question while we're talking about teacups and coffee? Any ideas on why the French always use bowls for coffee and tea, even?
Because people used to eat soup for breakfast, and when one shifted from soup to, then one ate soup out of a bowl, and when the shift happened to hot chocolate and coffee, and eventually tea, and particularly with the quantity of milk, it was food. In some sense, I mean, the soup was in some sense liquid. I mean, liquid and food, and this coffee or chocolate is also liquid or food. So that's where it, and you dunk in both cases. So it's a combination of bread and liquid.
Yeah, I was thinking because the English would never.
Yeah, no, and the tea.
It says something about the two cultures.
Yeah, and no, absolutely, and the tea followed coffee. So it's not nearly as, and it's much more an after. It's a tea and cake kind of thing also in France rather than drinking it normally. So I think we should call it a day since people have other things to do. So thank you very much.